Okay, calm down.
You wrote this book, which I highly recommend, by the way. Before we jump into, I guess, your trip on Ukraine, I wanted to ask you about whether you learned anything new or surprising when you were working on this book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, because you obviously knew about much of the history beforehand. Was there anything that you didn't know, though, before working on this book?
I didn't know that there were so many warnings that this was going to happen, that this was a war foretold, that we had so many people saying the expansion of NATO will lead to instability in the region. Russia will be forced to respond. And here we are. So gathering up so many of those testimonies, those cables, those letters, that kind of just hits you right in the face that this is something that could have so easily been avoided. So that's one of the things. I didn't realize, I guess, the huge difference between the east and west of the country. I used to think of Ukraine, and my grandmother is from Ukraine. She was a Jew from Ukraine, and I always thought that Russia and Ukraine were very close to each other, but that Ukraine was, pretty unified country. And realizing as I did the research, and then being in Western Ukraine recently, to understand just how divided that country has been for a long time, how much anti-Russian sentiment there has been for a long time in some parts of the country. That was something else that was new to me. And then there is the issue about the neo-Nazis, the ultra-nationalists, and getting a sense of how important or not important they have been during different periods in recent history was also something I learned by doing the research. So there were a lot of things. And it's interesting, Katie, that having written it now a year ago, we're about to do an updated edition.
Oh, great.
And what's really striking me is how sound the analysis is. How the only thing we have to update is where things are in terms of the war itself, some information that corroborates what we say in the book. For example, the fact that these interviews have come out with the head of Germany and France at the time of the signing of the Minsk Accords, that's Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, where they said, yeah, these accords weren't really to bring peace to Ukraine. It was to give us more time to build up the military, to start arming and training the Ukrainians. So things like that. We talk a lot in the book, which is so important. And I hope a lot of your listeners have heard this over and over again about the way that the negotiations early on in the war could have led to an agreement. But hearing the corroboration of that from then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett from Israel, when he went on to say, yeah, he too was involved in this, not just Erdogan from Turkey, and that they were close to a ceasefire agreement when the West blew that up. So those kind of things that have come out more recently just give more weight to our analysis.
Tell us about your recent Ukraine trip and what you learned from that.
Well, I was at a conference that I helped to organize in Vienna, Austria, which we chose because it's one of the few neutral countries left in Europe. There's Ireland, Switzerland, and Austria. And we decided to do the conference there to bring people not only from Europe, but from the global South as well. We were representatives of 32 different countries, including people from Russia, from Ukraine. It was quite a gathering that almost didn't happen because the Ukrainian minister to Austria said beforehand that this was a bunch of Putin apologists and that the trade union that was hosting us shouldn't host us. And there, 2 days before it was supposed to start, they pulled the plug and said we couldn't use their venue, just like the place we were going to do the press conference pulled the plug as well. It was really remarkable how negative the press was, but how positive the event was. And everybody in the event was condemning Russia for the invasion. But they went on to say, okay, what are we going to do about this now? And how are we going to push peace talks? So that's the background for my being in Europe, and then visiting a number of the Eastern European countries, meeting with people who were journalists, for example, and others trying to build up peace movements and really suffering from it, losing their jobs, being ostracized. Peace is a dirty word in many places. And then we went to Ukraine and Western Ukraine. I was with the retired Colonel Ann Wright, and we were in Lviv and talking to people about where they saw this going. And we really understood that every time you turn on the television, you saw the Ukrainians blowing up a Russian tank, the Ukrainians blowing up a Russian ship, the Ukrainians declaring victory on this, victory on that, and that people in the street really did believe that they were going to be able to take back all of Ukraine, every inch of the Donbass. They were going to be able to take back Crimea. And when we would say to them, you really think that that's possible, especially Crimea, they would the only people who were willing to express doubts were people who would say it very quietly and, don't use my name. And it's treasonous to talk about this. And the other thing that was very sad, Katie, is the level of hatred, not just at the leaders of Russia, at Putin and the soldiers, of course, totally understandable, but the hatred of Russian people, the hatred of Russian language, the hatred of Russian art, literature. I mean, it is to the point where there are stores that would have signs above the stores saying the language of the oppressor will not be tolerated here. And a lot of people moved from the war-torn areas of Eastern Ukraine to more safety in Western Ukraine, and they're Russian speaking. And they were feeling extremely vulnerable, afraid to speak in public. So it's a very tough situation. We saw funerals happening every day as we'd walk down the streets. And, 1 minute you'd think, wow, this place, you can hardly tell there's a war going on. People were out in the street late at night, cafes, having their beers, having their ice cream. There was a lot of merrymaking and very fancy, fashionable shops. But then another minute you would see a funeral happening in one of the churches. And when we went to the cemetery, it was the newly minted graves of hundreds of Ukrainians from Lviv who had been killed. And the families, the children weeping there, putting flowers on the grave. It was very sad. But what was really clear to me is that any opening for peaceful discussion of where this can go is going to have to come from Zelensky, because he is the one that have been at one point in late March, early April said, we're not going to be able to join NATO. Yeah. And he said all of those things early on, and people were, listening and certainly many of them agreeing. It's going to have to come from him now to say, we're going to have to go to the negotiating table. We can't keep this war going. It's too harmful for our people. But that's not going to happen. And people told us this quietly as well, until there is pressure from the U.S. to make it happen.